The silence was deafening. In the heart of the Amazon rainforest, where the symphony of life never stops, absolute silence means only one thing: danger. But what forest ranger Elias Rodriguez discovered that morning would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about animal behavior. A massive silverback gorilla stood face to face with a deadly mountain. Puma, its golden eyes locked in what should have been a fight to the death. But instead of violence, something impossible was happening. The puma, one of nature's most feared predators, was lying submissive, its powerful body trembling not with rage, but with desperate pleading. And the gorilla, Kazi, a 400-pound male who could snap a human in half, was reaching out with gentle hands, offering comfort to his natural enemy. The moment their foreheads touched through the sanctuary fence, witnesses gasped. Cameras captured what scientists are calling the most extraordinary display of interspecies compassion ever recorded. But this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was the culmination of a bond forged in tragedy, tested by survival, and proven through sacrifice. What you're about to witness will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the animal kingdom. Because sometimes, the most powerful force in nature isn't survival of the fittest. It's the memory of kindness that transcends all boundaries. But to understand how a gorilla and a puma became the most unlikely allies in the Amazon, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we dive into this incredible story, I need you to do something. Drop your country in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for Wind Echo Untold. Because stories like this, stories that restore your faith in compassion, need to be shared with the world. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this bond changed everything we know about animal intelligence. Elias Rodriguez had been walking the forest paths of the Amazonia Wildlife Sanctuary for over 15 years. His weathered hands had rescued countless animals. His eyes had seen miracles and tragedies in equal measure. But nothing had prepared him for what awaited him on that humid Tuesday morning in March. At 42, Elias carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who understood the language of the wild. His indigenous Guarani heritage had taught him to read the forest's moods like pages in a book. When the birds stopped singing, when the insects fell silent, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath, that's when you knew something extraordinary was about to unfold. The sanctuary sprawled across 50,000 acres of protected rainforest, home to over 300 species of rescued and rehabilitated wildlife. But among all the animals under Elias's care, none held a special place in his heart quite like Kazi. Kazi wasn't just any gorilla. At 12 years old and weighing nearly 400 pounds, this silverback had been hand-raised at the sanctuary since he was an infant. His mother had been killed by poachers when he was barely 2 months old, leaving him orphaned and traumatized. Elias had bottle-fed him, taught him to climb, watched him grow from a frightened baby into the magnificent silverback he was today. But Kazi was different from other gorillas. He possessed an almost supernatural intelligence, an ability to understand human emotions that unnerved even experienced researchers. Dr. Sarah Chen, the sanctuary's lead primatologist, had documented Kazi's IQ at levels that challenged conventional understanding of gorilla cognition. He could solve complex puzzles, demonstrate empathy toward other species, and most remarkably, he seemed to remember every animal that had ever shared his space. The gorilla had his own territory within the sanctuary, a semi-enclosed habitat that allowed him freedom while keeping him safe from poachers who still hunted the region for exotic animals. His family group consisted of 3 females and 2 younger males, all rescued under similar tragic circumstances. But Kazi was the protector, the leader, the one who made decisions that kept his family safe. What made Kazi truly special, though, was his capacity for what could only be described as compassion. Elias had witnessed him comfort injured birds, share his food with smaller animals, and even attempt to help trapped insects. It was as if this magnificent creature understood suffering in a way that transcended species barriers. On this particular morning, As Elias made his routine patrol through the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The usual cacophony of howler monkeys, exotic birds, and rustling leaves had been replaced by an oppressive quiet that made the hair on his arms stand on end. His radio crackled with normal chatter from other rangers, but out here in the deep forest, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Little did he know that 2 miles ahead, an encounter was about to unfold that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the natural world. The trap had been set with cruel precision. Hidden beneath a carefully arranged layer of leaves and branches, the steel-jawed snare waited like a mechanical predator for its victim. Poachers had been infiltrating the sanctuary's outer boundaries for months, setting illegal traps designed to capture exotic animals for the black market. Despite increased security and regular patrols, these criminals continued to threaten the sanctuary's mission. The Puma that stepped into the trap at dawn was no ordinary mountain cat. Luna, though she wouldn't be known by that name until much later, was a female mountain puma, 7 years old and in her prime. At 120 pounds of pure muscle and instinct, she was one of the forest's apex predators. Her golden coat bore the scars of territorial battles. Her amber eyes held the wisdom of countless hunts, and her powerful jaws could crush bones with ease. But Luna carried a secret that even she didn't fully understand. Years ago, as an orphaned cub barely 3 months old, she had been brought to this very sanctuary. Her mother had been killed in a landslide, leaving her weak and starving. The sanctuary's rehabilitation program had saved her life, nursing her back to health in a temporary enclosure that happened to be adjacent to the young gorilla habitat, where a juvenile Kazi was learning to navigate his own trauma. For 6 months, the baby Puma and the young gorilla had lived side by side, separated only by a chain-link fence. They had played together through the mesh, shared the curious bond that young animals form when confined together. Kazi would push fruits through the fence holes, and Luna would bat at his fingers with tiny claws that held no malice. They had comforted each other during storms, slept pressed against opposite sides of the fence, and formed a connection that defied natural instincts. But as Luna grew stronger and larger, the day came when she had to be released back into the wild. It was a bittersweet moment, necessary for her survival, heartbreaking for the connections she left behind. She had looked back once as the transport cage disappeared into the forest, her young eyes meeting Kazi's through the rear window. That was 7 years ago. 7 years of living as a wild predator, hunting, surviving, claiming her territory in the deep forest. The memory of that early bond had faded into the subconscious realm where childhood experiences lie dormant, waiting for the right trigger to resurface. The trigger came in the form of excruciating pain. When the trap's jaws snapped shut around her right front paw, Luna's roar of agony echoed through the forest for miles. The steel teeth bit deep into bone and sinew, creating a wound that would be fatal if infection set in. She thrashed wildly, her powerful body contorting as she tried to free herself, but the trap was anchored to a buried concrete block that wouldn't budge. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, the pain intensified, and Luna's strength began to wane. Dehydration set in, her breathing became labored, and for the first time in her adult life, this apex predator faced the reality of helplessness. That's when something deep in her primitive brain began to stir. A memory, a feeling, a desperate understanding that somewhere in this forest lived a creature who had once shown her kindness. Her enhanced sense of smell, weakened by pain but still functional, began to search for a scent she hadn't consciously recognized in 7 years. The scent of a friend. Kazi felt it before he heard it. The silverback gorilla had been sharing breakfast with his family group when an invisible wave of distress washed over him. His massive head lifted, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The other gorillas noticed his agitation immediately. When their leader sensed danger, survival instincts kicked in automatically. But this wasn't danger. This was something else. Something that made Kazi's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. He began to pace, his 400-pound frame moving with surprising grace as he circled the perimeter of his habitat. The females watched nervously as their protector displayed behavior they'd never seen before. He would stop, sniff the air, then continue pacing, his dark eyes scanning the forest canopy with increasing urgency. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the habitat just after 8 a.m. for her daily behavioral observations. What she found challenged her understanding of gorilla psychology. Kazi's exhibiting severe agitation, she spoke into her recorder, watching as the silverback repeatedly approached the eastern fence line. He's displaying none of his usual calm demeanor. Heart rate appears elevated, pupils dilated. He keeps looking toward the deep forest as if he's trying to locate something. For 3 hours, Kazi continued his restless patrol. He refused food, ignored the playful advances of the younger gorillas, and became increasingly focused on something beyond human perception. His distress calls, low, rumbling vocalizations that carried for miles through the forest, eventually reached Elias during his morning rounds. When the ranger arrived at Kazi's habitat, the gorilla immediately approached the fence. What happened next would haunt Elias for years to come. Kazi pressed his massive frame against the chain-link barrier and looked directly into Elias's eyes. Then, in a display of intelligence that defied scientific explanation, the gorilla pointed toward the deep forest and began to vocalize in a pattern Elias had never heard before. It wasn't aggressive posturing or territorial warnings. It was pleading. He's asking for help, Elias whispered to Dr. Chen, who had been documenting the interaction. I know this sounds impossible, but he's trying to tell us something needs our help. The first attempt to understand Kazi's distress came through tried and true methods. Dr. Chen brought out the symbol boards they used for cognitive testing, hoping Kazi might indicate what was troubling him. The gorilla showed no interest in the communication tools, instead returning repeatedly to the eastern fence, his urgency growing more apparent with each passing hour. Elias tried a different approach. He opened the secondary gate that led to the forest trail system, a path Kazi was familiar with from guided excursions. The gorilla immediately moved toward the opening but stopped, looking back at Elias with an expression that could only be interpreted as expectation. You want me to follow you? Elias realized. You want to show me something. The decision to allow Kazi into the forest went against protocol. Sanctuary rules required multiple staff members, safety equipment, and pre-approved routes for any gorilla excursions. But something in Kazi's demeanor convinced Elias that normal rules didn't apply to this situation. Armed with tranquilizer equipment and a radio, Elias opened the gate. Kazi immediately bolted into the forest, moving with purpose and speed that forced Elias into a jogging pace to keep up. The gorilla followed scent trails invisible to human senses, stopping occasionally to ensure his human companion was still following, then continuing deeper into territory that Elias rarely patrolled. 20 minutes into their journey, Kazi suddenly stopped. His massive body went rigid, his head cocked toward sounds Elias couldn't detect. Then, with movements so careful they seemed choreographed, the silverback began to approach something through the dense undergrowth. Elias followed, pushing through vines and low-hanging branches until he saw what had driven Kazi to such desperate measures. The scene before them defied everything Elias knew about predator-prey relationships. Luna lay trapped, her golden coat matted with blood and dirt, her powerful body weakened by hours of struggle against the steel trap. She should have been snarling, should have been a whirlwind of claws and fangs at the approach of any creature, especially one as large as Kazi. Instead, she lifted her head and released a sound Elias had never heard from a mountain puma, a low, almost conversational vocalization that sounded like recognition. Kazi approached to within 10 feet of the trapped predator and settled into a sitting position. The two animals looked at each other for a long moment, and then something extraordinary happened. The puma's tense body relaxed. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow. The fear in her amber eyes was replaced by something that looked remarkably like relief. This is impossible, Elias breathed into his radio as he called for the emergency rescue team. I'm looking at a silverback gorilla and a trapped mountain puma, and they're communicating. Dr. Chen's voice crackled back through the static. Elias, that's not possible. Pumas and gorillas have no natural relationship. They occupy completely different ecological niches. I'm telling you what I'm seeing, Elias insisted, his voice tight with awe. The puma isn't showing any signs of aggression. And Kazi is acting like he's comforting her. As if to prove Elias's point, Kazi began to vocalize, the same low, rumbling sounds he used to calm distressed members of his family group. The puma responded with soft, chirping vocalizations, a sound adult mountain pumas rarely make, except when communicating with their cubs. Elias had seen enough animal behavior to recognize what was happening, even if he couldn't explain it. These two apex species, natural enemies by every biological standard, were displaying behaviors associated with established social bonds. The emergency rescue team arrived 90 minutes later, led by Dr. Marcus Torres, the sanctuary's veterinarian. The team included 2 additional rangers, a wildlife rehabilitation specialist, and equipment designed to handle dangerous animal extractions. What they found challenged every protocol in their emergency response manual. How close is the gorilla? Dr. Torres called out as the team prepared their approach. About 8 feet from the puma, Elias responded. And he's not moving. The team's standard procedure required the removal or sedation of any potentially dangerous animals in the vicinity before beginning rescue operations. But Kazi's presence presented an unprecedented complication. Tranquilizing him might cause him to fall onto the already injured puma. Attempting to lure him away might agitate the trapped predator. Dr. Torres made the decision to proceed with Kazi present, but under strict monitoring. As the team approached, both animals remained remarkably calm. The puma, who should have been violently defensive, watched the humans with alert but non-aggressive eyes. Kazi observed the rescue preparations with what could only be described as intelligent interest. The trap removal required delicate precision. The steel jaws had caused significant tissue damage, but preliminary examination suggested the bone might be intact. Dr. Torres prepared a sedative dose appropriate for a mountain puma of Luna's size and weight. The moment the dart found its mark, Kazi's behavior changed dramatically. The silverback rose to his feet and took 2 steps back, his intelligent eyes never leaving the puma as the sedative took effect. It was as if he understood exactly what was happening and was giving the human rescuers space to work while remaining close enough to monitor the situation as Luna's eyes began to close and her body relaxed into unconsciousness. Kazi made a sound that Dr. Chen later described as the most emotionally complex vocalization she had ever recorded from a gorilla. It was part warning, part encouragement, part goodbye. The trap removal took 27 minutes. The steel jaws had crushed tissue and created a deep puncture wound, but X-rays taken on site confirmed that no bones were broken. Luna's paw would heal, though she would carry scars for the rest of her life. As the rescue team loaded the unconscious puma onto a transport stretcher, Kazi approached Dr. Torres, the veterinarian, who had worked with gorillas for over a decade, was stunned when the silverback gently reached out and touched the unconscious puma's head with one massive finger. He's saying goodbye, Elias realized. He knows we're taking her away, but Kazi had other plans. As the rescue team began the 2-mile trek back to the sanctuary's medical facility, they discovered they had acquired an escort. Kazi followed at a distance of approximately 50 feet, moving through the forest with the stealth of a creature half his size. Every attempt to discourage him from following failed. When rangers tried to block his path, he would simply find an alternate route. When Dr. Torres attempted to communicate with him using familiar hand signals, the gorilla would acknowledge the communication but continue following. We can't have a 400-pound gorilla loose in the medical facility. Dr. Torres radioed ahead to the sanctuary's main office. Then we'll have to keep him outside, came the reply from Dr. Patricia Vance, the sanctuary's director. but under no circumstances is he to be tranquilized unless he becomes aggressive. The procession that arrived at the sanctuary's medical compound was unlike anything the staff had ever witnessed. The rescue team carried an unconscious mountain puma while being followed by a silverback gorilla who showed no signs of agitation or territorial behavior. As Luna was carried into the surgical suite, Kazi positioned himself just outside the building. He sat down, his back against the exterior wall, and began what could only be described as a vigil. Dr. Chen arrived with her mobile observation equipment and began documenting behavior that would later be featured in multiple scientific journals. Hour 1 of observation, she recorded. Subject is maintaining a seated position outside the medical facility. No signs of agitation or desire to leave. Appears to be waiting. The surgical procedure to clean and suture Luna's wounds took 3 hours. Throughout the entire process, Kazi remained in position. He refused food and water offered by sanctuary staff. He showed no interest in returning to his family group, despite calls from the other gorillas. His entire focus seemed centered on the building where the injured puma was being treated. When Luna was moved to a recovery enclosure, a specially designed habitat that allowed injured animals to heal while remaining under medical observation, Kazi immediately relocated to a position with a direct line of sight to her cage, and that's when Dr. Chen made the discovery that would change everything while reviewing historical sanctuary records to document the unprecedented interaction. She uncovered files that made her hands tremble as she read. 7 years earlier, an orphaned puma cub had been brought to the sanctuary for rehabilitation. The cub had been housed in temporary enclosure 7, directly adjacent to temporary enclosure 8, where a young gorilla named Kazi had been recovering from his own trauma. The files contained photographs, images of a tiny puma cub and a juvenile gorilla playing through the chain-link fence that separated their enclosures. Pictures of them sleeping pressed against opposite sides of the barrier. Documentation of what the staff had dismissed as typical adjacent animal curiosity. But Dr. Chen saw something else in those photographs. She saw recognition in young Kazi's eyes. She saw trust in the puma cub's body language. She saw the formation of a bond that the scientific community would have deemed impossible. They knew each other, she whispered to Elias as they reviewed the files together. As babies, they were raised side by side for 6 months. The implications were staggering. Not only had these two animals remembered each other after 7 years of separation, but Luna had somehow sought out Kazi when she needed help. She had used her enhanced predator senses to locate the one creature in the forest who represented safety and comfort from her earliest memories. And Kazi had sensed her distress across miles of dense forest, had pleaded for human help, and had guided rescuers directly to her location. This changes everything we know about animal memory and interspecies bonding, Dr. Chen told the assembled sanctuary staff that evening. We're not just looking at an unusual animal interaction, we're documenting evidence of complex emotional memory that transcends species barriers. But the story was far from over. Luna's recovery period was estimated at 6 to 8 weeks, depending on how well her injured paw responded to treatment. The enclosure she occupied was designed to provide healing space while allowing for behavioral observation and medical monitoring. What the sanctuary staff didn't anticipate was that Kazi had no intention of leaving her side. For the first 3 days after the rescue, the silverback maintained his vigil outside Luna's recovery enclosure. He refused to return to his family habitat despite increasingly concerned calls from the other gorillas. Dr. Torres attempted to lure him back with favorite foods, but Kazi showed no interest in anything except the unconscious puma. On the 4th day, Luna woke up. Her first sight upon regaining consciousness was Kazi's massive silverback form, seated just 20 feet away, outside her enclosure. Instead of panic or territorial aggression, Luna's first response was a soft, chirping vocalization, the same sound she had made in the forest when Kazi first found her. The gorilla immediately rose and approached the enclosure fence. The two animals looked at each other for a long moment. And then, Luna did something that made Dr. Chen's breath catch in her throat. The injured puma limped to the fence line and pressed her uninjured side against the chain-link barrier. Kazi, moving with careful precision, placed his massive hand against the fence, directly opposite her body. They remained in this position for over an hour. "We're witnessing interspecies grief counseling," Dr. Chen observed to her research team. "The gorilla is providing emotional support to an injured predator, and she's accepting it as if they're members of the same social group." But Kazi's protective instincts went beyond emotional support. On the 7th day of Luna's recovery, something happened that would test the bond between the two animals in ways nobody could have anticipated. The poachers had returned. 3 men in camouflage gear approached the sanctuary's outer perimeter just before dawn on a Tuesday morning. They moved with the confidence of individuals who had successfully breached sanctuary security before, carrying equipment designed for animal capture rather than hunting. Their target wasn't random wildlife. Intelligence from previous raids had identified 2 high-value animals currently housed at the facility: a silverback gorilla worth over $200,000 on the black market, and a mountain puma that could bring $150,000 from private collectors who preferred exotic predators. The poachers had studied sanctuary patrol schedules, identified security camera blind spots, and developed a plan to reach both animals. During the early morning hours, when staff presence was minimal, what they hadn't accounted for was the extraordinary sensory capabilities of the animals they intended to capture. Luna detected their presence first. Her predator instincts, honed by 7 years of survival in the wild, recognized the scent of danger long before human senses could detect the intruders. Despite her injured paw, the mountain puma rose to her feet and began displaying behaviors associated with territory defense. But instead of preparing for solitary combat, Luna did something unprecedented. She looked directly at Kazi and released a series of vocalizations that Dr. Chen later described as warning calls, modified for interspecies communication. The sounds were louder than typical puma vocalizations, but not aggressive. They carried clear urgency, but were directed toward the gorilla rather than the approaching threat. Kazi's response was immediate and decisive. The silverback rose to his full height, over 6 feet when standing upright, and began to scan the forest perimeter with intense focus. His nostrils flared as he tested the air, his acute sense of smell confirming what Luna had already detected. Then Kazi did something that shattered every assumption about gorilla: territorial behavior. Instead of focusing on protecting his own habitat and family group, the silverback positioned himself between the approaching poachers and Luna's recovery enclosure. His massive frame blocked direct access to the injured puma, and his posture communicated a clear message: anyone wanting to reach her would have to go through him first. The lead poacher crested a small ridge overlooking the medical facility at 5:47 a.m. What he saw below made him signal for his companions to stop and reconsider their approach. A 400-pound silverback gorilla stood in protective position over a mountain puma's enclosure, his attention fixed directly on the poacher's location. There was no way the animals should have been able to detect human presence at that distance. But the gorilla's body language left no doubt that he knew exactly where the intruders were positioned. "Change of plans," the lead poacher whispered to his team. "We trank the gorilla first, then grab both animals while he's down." But Kazi had spent years observing human behavior at the sanctuary. He understood threat assessment, response protocols, and the significance of human weapons. When he saw the poachers raise their tranquilizer rifles, the silverback's protective instincts escalated to a level that nobody at the sanctuary had ever witnessed. His roar shook the forest. The sound that erupted from Kazi's chest was part territorial challenge, part alarm call, and part primal fury. It echoed across the sanctuary grounds with the force of a sonic boom, sending birds exploding from trees and causing every animal within a mile radius to respond with their own alarm calls. But Kazi wasn't finished. The silverback began to beat his chest with alternating fists, creating a rhythmic percussion that carried for miles through the forest. The sound was traditionally used by gorillas to communicate location and status to distant family members. Within minutes, Ghazi's call was answered. The 3 female gorillas and 2 younger males from his family group came crashing through the forest, their combined vocalizations creating a wall of sound that could be heard at the sanctuary's main facility 2 miles away. But they didn't stop there. Other animals began to respond to the gorilla alarm calls. Howler monkeys added their voices to the cacophony. A family of jaguars contributed roars from the eastern boundary. Even the typically silent ocelots began to vocalize, creating a symphony of alarm that indicated the entire forest was aware of the intruders. The poachers found themselves facing not just one protective gorilla, but an entire ecosystem united in defense of its inhabitants. What happened next would become the most documented example of interspecies cooperative defense ever recorded in scientific literature. The sanctuary's emergency response system activated automatically when the acoustic monitoring equipment detected Ghazi's alarm calls. Dr. Chen, sleeping in the on-site research quarters, was jolted awake by the sound of multiple gorilla alarm vocalizations, a pattern she had never heard. In 5 years of working with the family group, Elias received the emergency alert on his radio and immediately began coordinating with the sanctuary's security team. As head ranger, he had developed protocols for poacher intrusions, but nothing in his training had prepared him for what the security cameras were showing. On Monitor 7, which covered the medical facility perimeter, Ghazi stood in protective position over Luna's enclosure, his massive frame blocking access, while he maintained visual contact with threats the cameras couldn't yet detect. On Monitor 12, covering the eastern forest boundary, the other members of Ghazi's family group were converging on the medical facility with speed and purpose that indicated coordinated response rather than random panic. Most remarkably, Monitor 15 showed something unprecedented. Other sanctuary animals were positioning themselves in a defensive perimeter around the medical facility. Jaguars, ocelots, and even typically solitary species were working together to create a barrier between the facility and whatever threat had triggered Ghazi's alarm. It's like they're all responding to the same command, Dr. Chen observed as she watched the feeds from the emergency response center. The poachers, meanwhile, had underestimated both the intelligence of their intended targets and the speed of the sanctuary's security response. When the lead poacher raised his tranquilizer rifle to target Ghazi, the silverback's response was swift and strategic. Instead of charging, which would have left Luna's enclosure undefended, Ghazi began to demonstrate behavior that Dr. Chen later described as tactical intelligence. The gorilla picked up a fallen branch, approximately 6 feet long and thick as a baseball bat. With precision that suggested understanding of projectile physics, he hurled the branch directly at the lead poacher's position. The branch struck the tranquilizer rifle, sending the weapon flying and causing the poacher to stumble backward down the ridge. But Ghazi wasn't finished demonstrating his protective capabilities, as the second poacher attempted to circle around to a flanking position. Luna contributed to the defense in a way that shocked even experienced wildlife observers. Despite her injured paw, the mountain puma began to pace her enclosure in a pattern designed to draw attention to herself. Her movements were calculated to make her appear as an easier target than the gorilla, effectively using herself as bait to manipulate the poachers. Positioning, what Luna was actually doing was directing the poachers into a tactical trap. As the second poacher moved to get a clear shot at the easier target, he positioned himself directly in the path of the approaching gorilla family group. When Ghazi's female companions arrived at the medical facility, they found a human intruder positioned between them and their family leader. The response was swift and devastating. 3 female gorillas, each weighing over 200 pounds, emerged from the forest simultaneously. Their coordinated approach suggested communication and planning that challenged every assumption about gorilla tactical thinking. The poacher found himself surrounded by 4 silverbacks and facing the realization that his Tranquilizer rifle contained only enough sedative for one large animal, nowhere near sufficient to handle multiple gorillas displaying coordinated aggressive behavior. Meanwhile, the third poacher had attempted to approach Luna's enclosure from the rear. Thinking he could capture the injured, Puma, while his companions dealt with the gorilla threat, what he discovered was that Luna's injury hadn't diminished her predator capabilities. As the poacher approached the rear of the enclosure, Luna positioned herself in the shadows near the fence line. When he leaned in to assess the best method for opening the enclosure, she struck. Her uninjured paw lashed out through the chain-link mesh, razor-sharp claws raking across the poacher's forearm and leaving deep gashes that would require immediate medical attention. The man's screams of pain echoed across the sanctuary grounds, adding to the cacophony of alarm calls and guerrilla vocalizations that had turned the early morning into a battlefield. But the most extraordinary moment was yet to come, as the wounded poacher stumbled backward from Luna's enclosure. Bleeding and disoriented, he found himself facing Kazi at a distance of less than 10 feet. The silverback had left his protective position to confront the immediate threat to Luna. Standing at his full height, chest expanded with fury, Kazi presented a vision of primal power that few humans had ever witnessed and survived to describe. The poacher raised his hands in surrender, but Kazi had moved beyond territorial posturing into active protection mode. The gorilla charged. 400 pounds of muscle and bone covered the 10-foot distance in less than 2 seconds. The impact sent the poacher flying backward into a tree trunk with enough force to crack ribs and cause immediate unconsciousness. As the man collapsed, Kazi stood over his motionless form for a moment, then turned back toward Luna's enclosure. The mountain puma had moved to the front of her cage and was watching the aftermath of the battle with alert but calm eyes. When Kazi approached the fence, Luna made a sound that Dr. Chen later described as gratitude vocalization, a soft purring that adult mountain pumas rarely produce. Kazi reached through the fence and gently touched Luna's uninjured paw with one massive finger. The moment was captured by 3 different security cameras and would later become one of the most viewed wildlife videos in internet history. By the time sanctuary security and local law enforcement arrived on scene, they found 3 unconscious poachers, multiple gorillas standing guard over the intruders, and 2 animals displaying interspecies cooperation that challenged every existing model of predator behavior. But the most profound moment occurred after the immediate danger had passed, as medical personnel attended to the injured poachers and security staff began processing the crime scene. Kazi and Luna remained at the fence line, their faces pressed against opposite sides of the chain-link mesh. For nearly 20 minutes, they maintained this contact, occasionally making soft vocalizations that seemed to communicate reassurance and mutual protection. Dr. Chen documented every second of the interaction, knowing she was witnessing behavior that would redefine scientific understanding of animal intelligence and emotional capacity. What we're seeing isn't just unusual, she reported to Dr. Vance later that morning. It's revolutionary. These animals didn't just recognize each other after 7 years of separation. They formed a cooperative defense strategy that protected both of their lives. The implications went far beyond a single sanctuary incident. If animals could maintain emotional bonds across species lines and coordinate complex protective behaviors, it suggested levels of intelligence and empathy that science was only beginning to understand. But for Elias, watching Kazi and Luna comfort each other after their shared trauma, the scientific implications mattered less than the simple truth he was witnessing love, or something remarkably like it existed between species that had no evolutionary reason to care about each other's survival, and that love had just saved both their lives. The weeks following the poacher attack brought unprecedented attention to the Amazonia Wildlife Sanctuary. News organizations from around the world sent crews to document the gorilla and puma who had defended each other against human threats. Animal behavior specialists arrived from universities across 3 continents, all hoping to study what was being called the most significant interspecies bonding event in recorded history. But for Cassie and Luna, the media attention was irrelevant. Their focus remained entirely on each other. As Luna's paw healed over the following weeks, her daily routine became inseparable from Cassie's presence. Every morning, the silverback would position himself near her enclosure before she woke. Every evening he would remain until she settled for sleep. The pattern never varied, despite attempts by sanctuary staff to encourage him to spend more time with his gorilla family. Dr. Chen documented behaviors that challenged every existing model of animal psychology. Luna, a solitary predator by nature, began displaying pack behaviors typically seen only in social species. She would share her food by pushing portions through the fence mesh toward Cassie. She would mirror his movements, rising when he rose, sitting when he sat, as if they were members of the same family group. Cassie, meanwhile, had expanded his protective instincts to include Luna as part of his territory. When other animals approached her enclosure, he would position himself between them and the Puma, not aggressively, but with clear intent to monitor any interactions. Most remarkably, both animals had developed a complex communication system that transcended their species' normal vocalizations. They're creating a hybrid language. Dr. Chen reported to the international research team that had gathered to study the phenomenon. Cassie is using modified gorilla vocalizations that fall within Luna's hearing range, while Luna is producing sounds that seem designed to carry the emotional content that gorillas respond to. The breakthrough moment came during Luna's 6th week of recovery. Her injured paw had healed sufficiently for her to put weight on it, though she would always carry a slight limp as evidence of her encounter with the poacher's trap. Dr. Torres had cleared her for light movement and exercise, which meant she could explore the full space of her recovery enclosure for the first time since the rescue. As Luna tested her mobility, moving carefully around the perimeter of her cage, Cassie maintained his position at the fence line, but something in his posture had changed. Instead of the protective vigilance he had displayed for weeks, the silverback seemed expectant. Luna completed her circuit of the enclosure and approached the fence where Cassie waited. For a long moment, they looked at each other through the chain-link mesh. Then Luna did something that made every human observer hold their breath. She pressed her forehead against the fence, directly opposite Cassie's position. The gorilla responded immediately, pressing his own forehead against the barrier so that only inches and chain link separated them. They remained in this position for over 10 minutes. When they finally separated, both animals began to vocalize, not alarm calls or territorial claims, but soft, rhythmic sounds that Dr. Chen later described as comfort bonding. "They're saying goodbye," Elias realized, his voice tight with emotion. "They know she's ready to return to the wild." The decision to release Luna back into her natural habitat was medically sound, but emotionally devastating. Mountain pumas were not suited for long-term captivity, and Luna had demonstrated complete recovery from her injuries. Keeping her confined longer would be cruel to a wild predator who needed territory and hunting grounds to thrive, but releasing her meant separating two animals who had formed a bond that defied natural law. Dr. Vance called a meeting of the sanctuary's senior staff to discuss options that seemed impossible to reconcile. How do you separate two animals whose emotional well-being had become dependent on each other's presence? The solution came from an unexpected source. Cassie himself provided the answer. On the morning scheduled for Luna's release evaluation, the silverback did something unprecedented. Instead of maintaining his usual protective position near her enclosure, he moved to the eastern boundary of his habitat, the side that faced the deep forest where Luna would eventually be released. He sat down with his back to the medical facility and began to vocalize. The sounds weren't directed at Luna or at the human observers. They were directed toward the forest itself, as if Cassie was announcing something to the wilderness beyond the sanctuary boundaries. Dr. Chen recorded the vocalizations and played them back through the sanctuary's audio analysis equipment. The pattern was unlike anything in existing guerrilla communication databases. But when she compared the sounds to recordings of Luna's responses over the past weeks, she made a startling discovery. "He's teaching her," she whispered to Elias as they reviewed the data. "Cassie is vocalizing location patterns. He's telling her where to find him." The implications were staggering. Not only had Cassie accepted that Luna needed to return to the wild, but he was providing her with the acoustic information she would need to locate him from miles away in the dense forest. The release took place at dawn on a Tuesday morning. Exactly 2 months after Luna's rescue, the transport team carried her cage to a location 3 miles into the forest, far enough from the sanctuary to ensure she wouldn't become dependent on human care, but close enough that her territorial range might overlap with sanctuary boundaries. Cassie watched the transport vehicle disappear into the forest from his position at the eastern fence. His family group had gathered around him, as if they understood the significance of the moment when the cage door opened and Luna took her first steps into freedom. She paused at the forest edge and looked back toward the sanctuary. For a moment, her amber eyes seemed to focus on something beyond human vision. Then she released a single, powerful vocalization that echoed across the forest canopy. 3 miles away, Cassie answered. The sound that erupted from the silverback's chest carried all the power and emotion of their shared experience, the pain of separation, the promise of connection, and the hope that distance couldn't break the bond they had forged. Luna listened to Cassie's response, then turned and disappeared into the forest that had always been her true home. For 3 weeks, life at the sanctuary returned to something resembling normal routine. Cassie resumed his interactions with his gorilla family, though he continued to spend significant time at the eastern boundary of his habitat. The media attention gradually faded as news cycles moved on to other stories. Dr. Chen continued her behavioral observations, documenting what she assumed would be a gradual return to typical gorilla social patterns. She was wrong. On a humid Thursday morning in late spring, Elias was conducting his routine patrol of the sanctuary's eastern boundary when he noticed something that made him stop and reach for his binoculars. A flash of golden movement in the trees, approximately half a mile beyond the sanctuary fence. Luna had returned, but she wasn't alone. Moving through the forest with careful precision, following scent trails that led directly toward Cassie's habitat, Luna was accompanied by 2 cubs. They were approximately 4 months old, still spotted with the markings of juvenile mountain pumas, but already showing the confident movements of their mother's offspring. Dr. Chen arrived within minutes of Elias's radio call, bringing her mobile observation equipment and a mixture of scientific excitement and personal joy that she struggled to contain professionally. "She's bringing her cubs to meet Cassie." Dr. Chen breathed as she focused her cameras on the approaching family. "She's introducing her offspring to the animal who saved her life." Cassie had detected Luna's approach long before human observers spotted her. The silverback was positioned at the eastern fence, his massive frame vibrating with an energy that his family group recognized immediately. When Luna emerged from the tree line with her cubs, the reunion between the 2 friends was captured by multiple cameras and would later become one of the most shared wildlife videos in internet history. Luna approached to within 20 feet of the fence and sat down, her cubs flanking her with the curiosity typical of young predators exploring new territory. She looked directly at Cassie and released the same soft vocalization she had used during their weeks together at the sanctuary. Cassie's response was immediate and profound. The silverback approached the fence and sat down, mirroring Luna's position. Then he began to vocalize, not the modified communication sounds they had developed during her recovery, but traditional gorilla family calls. He was introducing himself to her cubs. For the next hour, the most unlikely family reunion in natural history unfolded before amazed human observers. Luna's cubs, with the fearlessness of youth, approached the fence to investigate the enormous silverback who seemed to hold such importance for their mother. Cassie remained perfectly still as tiny paws batted at his fingers through the chain-link mesh. When one of the cubs became tangled in a vine near the fence line, Cassie gently freed the small animal, using movements so careful they seemed choreographed. Luna watched the interaction between her cubs and her friend with alert but relaxed eyes. Her body language communicated complete trust, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of an already extraordinary encounter. As the morning progressed, Luna began to demonstrate hunting techniques to her cubs, using the area near Cassie's fence as a training ground. The silverback became an audience to Puma family education, watching with obvious interest as Luna taught her offspring the skills they would need to survive in the wild. When the family finally departed, returning to their territory deeper in the forest, Luna paused at the tree line for a final exchange with Cassie. The vocalization she produced was complex, carrying multiple emotional layers that Dr. Chen spent months analyzing. But to the human observers who witnessed the moment, the meaning was clear. She was saying thank you, and she was promising to return. Over the following months, Luna's visits to the sanctuary boundary became a regular occurrence. She would arrive with her cubs every 2 to 3 weeks, always approaching Cassie's habitat for what could only be described as family visits. The cubs grew stronger and more confident with each visit, and Cassie became an unofficial uncle to the young Pumas. He would bring them fruits and vegetables from his own food supply, pushing the offerings through the fence mesh. He would demonstrate tool use, a behavior mountain Puma cubs wouldn't naturally observe, by showing them how to manipulate objects for problem solving. Most remarkably, Luna began to use these visits as opportunities to teach her cubs about safety around humans. Dr. Chen documented instances where Luna would position her cubs near the fence while Elias conducted his patrols, allowing them to observe human behavior from a safe distance while remaining under both her protection and Cassie's oversight. She's using the sanctuary as a controlled environment for cub education. Dr. Chen reported to the International Research Consortium that had formed to study the ongoing relationship. Luna is leveraging her bond with Cassie to provide her offspring with experiences they couldn't get anywhere else in the wild. The implications for understanding animal intelligence and social learning were revolutionary, but the most profound moment came during Luna's 7th visit to the sanctuary. The cubs, now nearly 8 months old and approaching independence, had begun to explore territory beyond their mother's immediate supervision. During what should have been a routine family visit, one of the young Pumas wandered too far from the group and became separated in the dense forest undergrowth. Luna's distress calls echoed across the sanctuary grounds as she searched for her missing offspring. But instead of conducting a solitary search, she did something unprecedented. She approached Cassie's fence and began to vocalize in the specific patterns they had developed during her recovery, the sounds that meant help needed. Cassie's response was immediate. The silverback began to produce the long-range location calls that gorillas use to coordinate with distant family members. His vocalizations carried for miles through the forest, creating acoustic landmarks that could guide lost animals back to safety. Within 20 minutes, the missing cub emerged from the undergrowth, following Cassie's calls directly to the sanctuary boundary. Luna's reunion with her offspring was emotional enough to bring tears to human observers' eyes. But what happened next challenged every assumption about interspecies gratitude. After ensuring both her cubs were safe, Luna approached the fence where Cassie waited. In full view of multiple cameras and research personnel, she reached through the mesh and touched the silverback's hand with her own paw. They remained in contact for several minutes, and when they finally separated, both animals seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. Luna wasn't just visiting a friend anymore. She had created an extended family unit that transcended species boundaries, providing her cubs with protection and learning opportunities that no wild puma had ever experienced. Cassie had become more than a protector. He had become a co-parent to animals he had no biological reason to care about. The scientific community was forced to develop new terminology to describe what they were witnessing, because existing models of animal behavior had no framework for interspecies cooperative parenting. But for the sanctuary staff who observed these interactions daily, the scientific implications mattered less than the simple truth they were witnessing. Love had created a family that existed nowhere else in nature, and that family was thriving. 6 months after Luna's first return visit with her cubs, Dr. Patricia Vance stood before an audience of international wildlife researchers, conservation specialists, and media representatives gathered at the Amazonia Wildlife Sanctuary. Behind her, on a massive projection screen, played footage that had captivated the world. Cassie and Luna's ongoing relationship, now documented across nearly a year of unprecedented interspecies cooperation. What we've witnessed here challenges every assumption we've held about animal intelligence, emotional capacity, and the boundaries of natural behavior, Dr. Vance told the assembled crowd. But more importantly, it reminds us that compassion isn't limited by species, that memory transcends biology, and that love, in whatever form animals experience it, creates bonds that survival instinct alone cannot explain. The footage behind her shifted to show the most recent visit from Luna and her cubs, now nearly adult and preparing for independence. Cassie had spent hours demonstrating tool use and problem-solving techniques that would serve them well in their wild territories. Luna had allowed her offspring to play with the silverback through the fence mesh, providing them with social experiences that no wild mountain puma had ever received. But the most powerful image was the simplest. Two friends, separated by chain link and evolutionary distance, touching foreheads in a gesture of connection that needed no scientific explanation. The bond between Cassie and Luna has taught us something profound about the nature of consciousness in animals, Dr. Chen added during her portion of the presentation. We're not just looking at learned behavior or conditioned responses. We're witnessing evidence of complex emotional memory, cooperative decision-making, and intentional relationship building that crosses species lines. For Elias, watching from the back of the audience, the scientific terminology felt inadequate to describe what he had experienced firsthand. He had seen Cassie's desperate plea for help on that first morning when Luna lay trapped. He had witnessed the gorilla's gentle comfort during her recovery. He had watched Cassie teach Luna's cub skills that might save their lives. He had observed a friendship that had grown from childhood trauma into adult protection and mutual care. What Elias had seen was love in action. As the presentation concluded and the audience dispersed, Elias made his way to Cassie's habitat for the evening feeding routine. The silverback was positioned, as always, at the eastern fence, watching the forest for signs of Luna's approach. It had been 4 days since her last visit, but Cassie showed no signs of giving up his vigil. She'll be back, Elias told the magnificent gorilla as he refilled the water containers. She always comes back. Cassie acknowledged his caretaker's presence with a soft grunt, but didn't move from his position. Somewhere in the forest, his friend was teaching her cubs the final lessons they would need for independent survival. Soon, they would disperse to claim their own territories, following the natural cycle that governed mountain puma family structure. But Luna would continue to visit. The bond she shared with Cassie had become a permanent part of both their lives, a connection that provided emotional anchoring in a wild world full of dangers and uncertainties. As the sun set over the Amazon canopy, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched Luna's coat, Elias reflected on everything that had unfolded since that morning when Cassie had first pleaded for help. The sanctuary had become famous worldwide. Research teams from 6 countries had established permanent observation posts to study ongoing developments in the Cassie-Luna relationship. Documentary crews had produced films that reached millions of viewers, spreading awareness about conservation issues and the complex inner lives of wild animals. But beyond the fame and scientific recognition, something simpler and more profound had taken root. Two animals had chosen to love each other across impossible boundaries. They had protected each other from human threats. They had shared in the raising of the next generation. They had created a family based not on genetics or territorial necessity, but on recognition, trust, and genuine care. In a world where division seems to dominate every headline, where differences are highlighted more often than similarities, the story of Cassie and Luna offers something desperately needed. Proof that connection is possible between beings who have every reason to be enemies. Their bond teaches us that memory can preserve love across years of separation. That intelligence can recognize friendship beneath surface differences. That protection can be offered without expectation of reward. That family can be chosen rather than merely inherited. If a gorilla and a mountain puma can overcome evolutionary programming to care for each other's well-being, what does that say about the possibilities that exist between humans who share far more similarities than differences? Cassie and Luna didn't need to understand the scientific implications of their relationship. They didn't require academic validation for their choice to remain connected. They simply recognized something valuable in each other and decided that preserving that connection was worth the effort, the risk, and the devotion. Their story reminds us that love, whatever name we give it, is perhaps the most powerful force in nature. More powerful than territorial instinct, more persistent than survival programming, more enduring than the barriers that seem to separate us. Today, Cassie continues his role as protector and family leader at the Amazonia Wildlife Sanctuary. His intelligence and capacity for interspecies communication have made him a valuable partner in the rehabilitation of other animals. Young gorillas learn social skills from his example, while injured animals of various species seem to find comfort in his presence. Luna and her cubs, now fully independent, have established territories throughout the forest surrounding the sanctuary. Camera traps have captured evidence that all three animals continue to visit Cassie's habitat regularly, maintaining family bonds that defy every model of mountain puma social behavior. The cubs have begun displaying behaviors learned during their time with Cassie, using tools and solving problems in ways that no wild mountain pumas have ever been documented to do. They appear to be passing these learned behaviors to other young pumas they encounter, creating a ripple effect that may influence the entire regional population. The research generated by studying Cassie and Luna's relationship has led to new approaches in wildlife rehabilitation, conservation strategy, and our understanding of animal consciousness. Universities around the world now include interspecies relationship studies in their animal behavior curricula, but perhaps the most important legacy is simpler and more personal. Every day, thousands of people watch videos of Cassie and Luna's interactions. They see two beings who chose to care for each other despite having no evolutionary reason to do so. They witness protection offered across species lines, comfort shared between natural enemies, and love that transcends biological boundaries. And perhaps, in watching this impossible friendship, viewers begin to believe that their own impossible connections might be worth fighting for, that forgiveness can bridge any gap, that understanding can overcome any difference, that love in all its forms really can change the world. This is the power of their story. This is the research legacy of Cassie and Luna. Their story changed how science understands animal consciousness. It challenged assumptions about intelligence, emotion, and the boundaries of love in nature. But most importantly, it reminds us that connection is always possible, even when everything suggests it should be impossible. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in the power of unlikely friendships, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button for Wind Echo Untold. Because stories like this, stories that restore faith in compassion and connection, need to be shared with the world. We bring you the most incredible true stories of survival, friendship, and hope from across the globe. Leave a comment below and tell us, what's the most unlikely friendship you've ever witnessed? Have you ever seen love transcend boundaries that seemed impossible to cross? Your story might be the next one we tell, and please Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that love comes in forms we never expect, from places we never imagine, and that the most beautiful connections often happen between the most unlikely pairs. Because if a gorilla and a mountain puma can choose to be family, what's stopping us from choosing to see the potential for connection in our own lives? Subscribe now, share their story, and keep believing in the impossible, because sometimes the impossible is exactly what the world needs to see.